Hello, Year 12. Welcome back to another week of videos. We're going to jump straight into it today. Make sure you go to the contents page, highlight the date, highlight the lesson, and date it as you go. Now, we're going to be looking at housing today and its relation to SVR and social inclusion for Aboriginal people. Now, with housing, before we get too far into it, housing is related to, as you guessed, the physical dwelling in which you live in and the idea of having shelter. But it is also, a lot of the stats we're going to be looking at to do with housing is a lot to do with household income as well. So a lot of people tend to think that this is something that might have fallen under employment, and it's a fairly reasonable thing to assume that. However, all the data puts it under the category of housing. So whenever we're talking about household income, just so that you note for your HSC, if you ever get a question on housing, that you can talk about household income within here as well. Where the difference is with employment is whether you're talking about someone's, say, individual salary. Okay, but if we're looking at a household, and that's very much what you look at in housing, so you're looking at the family's total income, then that's where it falls under housing, just as an FYI. So first activity, as always, is to recap and link why housing is an important socially valued resource, as well as which human right it relates to. Again, if you're not sure, check out the implications table number 1 there, but you can also go back to this gorgeous little infographic that you have here, which will tell you why it's important, and we'll tell you which human right it relates to. So, I mean, your answers are secretly hidden in there at the start of each week. So, moving on, we're going to do a quick overview, look at our data comparison as evidence, and then our implications for life chances. So, to start off with, having a safe, secure home with working facilities, so that's, toilet, bathroom, kitchen, living areas, the lights in the house work, the plumbing works, the electrical systems work, the roof doesn't have leaks in it, so when it rains you're getting saturated. So having working facilities is really important, and it's a key factor in supporting the health and well-being of everyone, but particularly Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians, as that's our main focus study here. So if you do not have affordable, secure or appropriate housing, you can have a lot of negative consequences on your life. That's including homelessness as the most obvious one, being without a home. It can also lead to poor health. If you don't have a roof over your head, you're more likely to get sick, being out in the cold. But as well as if you don't have key or working facilities, so let's say the toilet in the house is broken, that can spread a lot of disease and uncleanliness. It's not very sanitary. If your shower's not working, people are more likely to get sick because they're not as clean. And if other amenities such as the kitchen's not working properly, your nutrition's probably not going to be as great either. So you can see how this feeds into poor health. And it also has lower rates of employment and education participation too. Now, the main reason for this being in terms of education and employment is that if you have a secure house, aka you either own it or you're a long-term tenant, you are more likely to settle down. You're more likely to have a job that's closer to home. You're more likely to go to school in the local area. If you are experiencing exclusion from housing, you're more likely to be moving around the place, and so therefore your participation in the workforce and education is significantly impacted due to just the nature of your environment and how close you are to work. So that can affect it as well. Now, in terms of our data comparison here with housing, housing, as long as our next lesson on healthcare, probably has the most or some of the most data. Why that is, I'm not sure. It's just on the government's website, so the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare, where I get most of this from. There's a lot of data on housing. So I'll break it down each into dot points here. So you've got, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 bits of data here to pull up. So you should be very well equipped if you get a HSC question on this. So start with the first one. 38% of Indigenous Australians were homeowners, compared to 67% for non-Indigenous. So you are almost 2 times more likely to own a home if you are non-Indigenous. Very close there. 57%, and a lot of this has got to do with, if we look back at our other SVRs and how they all link together, if we look at things like employment's probably the big one, with having lower individual incomes, but then you even look at what affects those incomes. It's education, how well educated are you, what sort of degrees and jobs are you getting that are higher paid, which can affect home ownership. It's also things like the justice system. If you're locked up in jail, you're not going to be able to afford to buy a house. So you can see how all the other SVRs, and then, when we get into healthcare, we'll look at life expectancy being shorter and things like that as well. So they all feed into each other, but that's probably one of the main reasons why it's home ownership is lower. 57% of non-Indigenous people in Australia are renting, with 42% among these in social housing, compared to 32%. Hold on, I think there's a stat that's wrong there. That should be Indigenous there. If you could make that correction, that would be fantastic. So 57% of Indigenous people and Australians are renting, and 42% out of those 57% are in social housing. Now, social housing, if you want to draw an arrow above here, is housing that is owned by the government. So typically, if you are in social housing, you have to have certain conditions to qualify to be able to access social housing. So things like a very low income, a low household income, healthcare issues, other sort of styles of hardship. If you're a child that's part of the foster care system or in out of home care, you have a lot of access to social housing. So this is housing that the government owns, or typically that's some other foster agency or humanitarian organisation will own. So you don't necessarily own it. The rent's typically a lot cheaper, but a lot of the time you're boarding or sharing with a lot of other people. And then the social housing has a lot of terms and conditions attached to it. So for example, say you're eligible for social housing, there's certain attachments that you need to be, actively seeking employment, or you need to, sign some kind of contract which, you're only there for a limited amount of time before you have to move on. So the idea that access to social housing is more likely if you're Aboriginal Australian as well. Again, we look at other SVRs and issues there, which makes it more likely. If you compare this to non-Indigenous, where 32% are renting, but only 4% of these are in social housing. So what this means is that you are 10 times more likely, if you're Aboriginal Australian, highlighting all the 10 times more likelies, they're huge, to be in overcrowded social housing. So you might be living with 2 or 3 other families in a social housing space. You might be a child sharing a bedroom with people that aren't even part of your family, sort of thing. Or you might be in and out of different houses too. My brother used to work in social housing, and he was saying that, you might have 2 days a week at a house in this suburb, 3 days a week at another house in another suburb. So it can be quite tricky and hard, especially for young people. So almost 10 times more likely to be in social housing if Aboriginal Australian. That's huge. Speaks of a lot of social exclusion. We look at 29% of Indigenous Australians, they were living in a dwelling with major structural problems, compared to